All right, so today we're going to talk about ethics in Judaism. This is an aspect of Judaism that you have hopefully done some reading of in the World's Wisdom text as well as the Prothero text, so that you can make sense of some of these laws and commandments that are a part of the Jewish ethical system. So the first point that we're going to talk about is halakha. And halakha means law. It translates literally to the law, but it can also mean way or path, as Prothero tells us. And in ethics, for Judaism, the approach is through a series of laws. So if you remember back to the beginning of this unit, we talked about the covenant between Abraham and God. Right, that they entered into a covenant or contractual relationship or agreement with each other, and both sides had responsibilities in that covenant. What Abraham was asked to do by God was simply to follow God, to obey God, to trust God. So that idea is expanded with the individual Moses. So we've already talked about the Exodus story. The person of Moses and his role in that, but he also has a very important role to play in Jewish law. So after the story of the Exodus, the Jewish people end up wandering around the desert for a long time, sort of following the path that God lays out for them. But during that time, God also gives Moses a set of laws. He says, we're going to renew the covenant, and now instead of just the Jewish people following me or obeying me, I'm going to give them a specific set of laws that they have to follow as part of their side of the covenant. So God reveals this law code to Moses. He reveals the Halacha. So the Halacha is the Jewish law code. And it's not just a couple of laws, right? It's not just the 10 Commandments, which you read and we'll talk about in a minute. It's 613 laws. So recorded in the Torah are 613 rules that, according to the Torah, God gave to Moses on Mount Sinai to write down, to record, and then tell to the Jewish people and keep those laws, that would be their part of the covenant. That's what they had to do. They had to follow this list of laws. So ethics in Judaism are very much codified, right? Because they were given by God this very detailed, very explicit list of laws that they have to follow. There are, because there's so many of them, they really, they incorporate every aspect of daily life. There are rules, there are ethical rules, which are sort of highlighted in the 10 Commandments, which we can talk about now. So one part of the 613 laws are the 10 Commandments. These laws focus on the oneness of God, on Jews worshiping God and not worshiping other gods, other deities, and how to worship God. But they also focus on ethical requirements, loving your mother and father, not killing, not committing adultery, not coveting or being jealous of what other people have. So part of these laws are ethics, sort of ethical norms about how to treat people, how to treat others with compassion, with justice, with fairness. And those are some of the other laws that you'll be reading in the World's Wisdom text as well. But because there's so many of them, they also, have requirements in there about the food that you eat, the clothes that you wear, how to wear your hair, how to observe the Sabbath, what you should do and not do on the Sabbath day. How to treat your friends, how to treat your enemies, how to treat those you do business with. There are just so many different aspects of them, how to do your farming, how to treat your animals, that they really encompass, as I said, every aspect of daily life. So for Jewish people who still live a law under the Mosaic Code, in a minute we'll talk about how in modern day Judaism, not all Jews follow all 613 of these laws, but for those who do, who try in their daily lives as much as possible to follow every single one of these laws, for them, they say that it is a mystical experience because every action that you do in life is done in observance of God, right? just with you, if you have to eat certain foods or stay away from certain foods. Just a mundane activity like preparing your food and eating your food is done with thinking about God, right? You're thinking about God as you do that. Because you know that you have to be careful, right? You have to be careful about what foods you eat, what foods you don't eat, and things like that. So because it is just so all-encompassing, Jews say that it creates a life lived in the presence of God. And the idea behind it has to do with that concept that we talked about of the chosen people. In the preface to the Ten Commandments, God says, that you are my chosen people, and I'm calling you to be a holy nation and a priestly people. So the idea also is that living a life according to Torah law, according to the Halacha, your life is very different from non-Jews. You are wearing different clothing. You are eating different foods. You do business differently. Your Sabbath requirements are different. So that's something that is going to call attention to you, right? I live a different kind of life because I believe God has asked my community to do this. So it sort of shines that light on the Jewish people, on the chosen people, that they can do this, right? That they can live the way God wanted them to, even if it's very different from how the rest of society lives their lives. So part of it is also just to do things differently, right? To live a different type of life, to show the world that the Jewish people are a people set apart. They are the chosen people, and they are following these ritualistic laws, this holiness code. So the Halacha is the term used to refer to all 613 of these laws. The 10 Commandments are these sort of core ethical teachings that are sort of at the heart or at the center of the Halacha of the 613 laws. And also to mention, it mentions this in the text, but the laws, the individual laws, are called mitzvot. So the Hebrew terms here, the Halacha is the law code in general, but the individual laws are mitzvot. So there's 613 mitzvot in the Halacha, in the entire Halacha. And then within that 613 are the 10 commandments, or the 10 sayings, as Jews often call them. Part of this 613 mitzvot has to do with the dietary restrictions. This tends to be the part of the holiness code that many non-Jews are familiar with. They know that Jews follow certain restrictions about what they eat. And this is known as either kosher or kashrut. So the two terms refer to this group of dietary restrictions. So many Jews choose to eat kosher. And it's not just one rule. To eat kosher doesn't just mean one thing. It's a whole collection of laws, or a collection of rules about the different types of foods that Jews can and cannot eat. So there's a couple of general rules. I won't go over all of them. But in general, Jews are not supposed to eat pork or shellfish. So stay away from any products that come from a pig, as well as fish that have exoskeletons. So their skeleton is on the outside of their body, like a shrimp, for example. Shrimp or lobster, those are shellfish, right? Because they have the hard shell on the outside of their bodies. And how you prepare meat has to be done in a certain way for the types of meat that they can eat. It has to be killed in a humane way, so the amount of pain that the animal feels has to be minimized, and all of the blood has to be drained out of it. And this you'll read in the World's Wisdom text. So the idea is that the blood of an animal is sort of the life force, or the life essence of that animal. So it's just inappropriate for human beings to consume that, to consume the blood of another animal. So to prepare meat kosher, you usually slit the animal's throat, either to kill it or after death. And then you hang the animal upside down so that all of the blood drains out of the animal. You can't eat meat with the blood still in it. So those are some of the rules. Some of the other ones that you may be familiar with already are that Jews are not supposed to eat meat and dairy in the same meal or in the same dish. So those two groups of food should be kept separate. So anytime you eat meat, you should not be mixing it with dairy, and vice versa. So something like a cheeseburger is not kosher. Right? Observant Jews cannot eat a cheeseburger. The idea behind this is that in the Torah, it doesn't say that you can never eat meat and milk together. The law about it says that you cannot cook a calf in its mother's milk. So if you think back to this time period of the Jewish people, they were still a wandering nomadic tribe. So they had herds of animals. They had animals like sheep and goats and things like that. And some of those animals they would use for the meat, and some of those animals they would use for their milk, right? They would keep them alive to extract milk from them, to make dairy products, and some of them they would kill for their meat. And so many of these animals, of course, were related to each other because it was all one herd of animals. So the idea was that if you killed the younger animal, if you killed like a baby animal, because the meat of a baby animal is very tender, it's somehow just cruel and inappropriate to cook the baby in the mother's milk. So if you were making a meat dish that had some sort of a creamy sauce or something like that, then you would be taking the milk from the mother to cook the meat of the baby. And that is just, it's just cruel and inhumane to do that. So the specific restriction says that you can't cook the calf in the mother's milk. But we talked already about the Mishnah and the Talmud and the interpretations and understandings of these laws. So later rabbis interpreted this rule, sort of expanded this rule to say that, well, you know what, in our modern world, it's pretty much impossible to tell if we buy a piece of meat and we buy milk or cheese. We can't know for sure that the two cows that those products came from, or the two animals that those products came from, were related to each other. We just can't know that. It's too hard to know because we're so far removed from that process. So just to make sure that you never do that, just in general, keep those two ingredients separate. So if you're going to have, a recipe with dairy in it, then it has to be a vegetarian dish. If you're going to have a recipe with meat in it, then it has to be dairy-free, and just keep those things completely separate. So that's one important aspect of eating kosher, is to keep those two food categories separate in terms of meals and recipes and things like that. So keeping kosher, as I mentioned, it's sort of this collection of rules. There's several other rules, of course, about eating kosher. Some Jews eat kosher all the time, so their diet, their daily diet, revolves around these rules, only eating what is kosher. Some Jews may eat kosher on holidays, on special Jewish holidays, which we'll talk about next. So many Jews don't necessarily follow these dietary restrictions every day anymore, but they would do so on special days throughout the year. And traditional Jewish foods are kosher, right? Revolve around these rules and making sure that you eat kosher on holidays. So those are just some of the more well-known rules or mitzvot within the Halacha. Then down here I have various interpretations of the law. So when we get to the society dimension, we'll talk about the specific denominations of Judaism that are popular today. But it's important to know that today there are various denominations of Judaism, and a big difference between these denominations is how strictly they still follow the Halacha, or how they understand the Halacha. There are some Jews, Orthodox and conservative Jews, who still believe that as much as it is humanly possible, we should try to follow all 613 of these mitzvot. This was a law code given by God. God asked the Jewish people to follow these laws, and because they're divine, that means they're still binding. So unless there's some reason that you can't follow a certain law, it's not possible anymore, every single law should be followed as much as it can be followed. Because these rules were given, thousands of years ago in a very different society. The Hebrew people were living a very different lifestyle. Some of them are difficult to follow. So some of them definitely have been modified or changed in significant ways. But there are Jews who still say, these are the laws God gave us, so it's our responsibility to follow these laws. Some of the more, you could say, liberal or progressive denominations like Reform or Reconstructionist or Humanistic Judaism see the Halacha as an important part of Judaism's history, right? It's something that God gave to the Jewish people, but if God called the Jewish people to be a priestly people and a holy nation, then we can understand that in a spiritual sense and not necessarily in a literal sense. In sort of the understanding that the Jewish people can continue to follow the ethical rules, the mitzvot that have to do with love and justice and compassion and mercy and worship of God and obeying God and things like that. But they don't necessarily, it doesn't make sense to them to follow the rules about not eating shellfish anymore, and when to cut one's hair and what type of clothing to wear. So for these denominations of Judaism, they say that it just doesn't make sense anymore to follow many of these rules. The world has changed so much, society has changed so much, so it's still possible to follow the spirit of the law without following the letter of every single one of these 613 laws. So really the biggest difference in terms of these denominations is how they understand Jewish ethics, right? Is living a good Jewish life, does that mean being observant, following all 613 of these laws every single day as much as you possibly can? Or does living a good Jewish life mean being a good person, trying to, enact justice and mercy and goodness in the world, but not necessarily worrying about all these many, many laws that have to do with, minute aspects of everyday life. So for many Jews, they've decided that just doesn't make sense anymore for them, that they still feel that they can live a good life, to be a holy people, to be a priestly people, without necessarily worrying about hundreds and hundreds of these laws that regulate every aspect of their everyday lives. And so we'll talk more about those denominations when we get to the society page. Okay, then just the last thing I have here is this phrase tikkun olam. And in Hebrew, this means to repair the world or repairing the world. And this has become a very popular notion in Jewish ethics today. And it has to do with sort of this idea that in general, the Jewish people are called by God to be a holy people, to be a priestly people, that they are supposed to enact the goodness of God in the world, right? If God is wholly good, perfect, loving, compassionate, just, and he has chosen the Jewish people to be his special people on earth, then that means that he wants the Jewish people to especially emphasize those qualities. So tikkun olam refers to this idea that it is the responsibility of the Jewish people to repair the world, to do whatever they can to make the world a better place. That being God's chosen people means that God chose them to do this. God chose them to sort of lead the way, be leaders of social justice and equality and equal treatment of all people. That is what it means in the modern world to be a good Jewish person, to be a strong Jewish community, is to, whenever and wherever possible, engage in tikkun olam, engage in trying to repair the world, to leave the world a better place than where you found it or how you found it. So this has become a very popular notion in American Judaism, as well as other sort of progressive and liberal forms of Judaism, that we can sort of move away from the Halacha and from these, all these different rules, and we can take on this general sense of repairing the world, improving the world from the way that we found it. Okay, so that's all I have for ethics, and then next we're going to talk about some of the major rituals in Judaism, of which there are quite a few. So that one we actually have a couple of slides for that one. All right.